And we have a great benefit today of having Robert J. Sawyer here to talk with us. Science fiction is not what you think. Since the dawn of the genre, science fiction has been at the forefront of social justice debates. If you suppose you know what science fiction is all about because you've seen Star Wars, Hugo and Nebula Award-winning best-selling author Robert J. Sawyer will show that Star Wars isn't science fiction and introduce you to real science fiction, a profound mode of storytelling. Called the Dean of Canadian Science Fiction by the Ottawa Citizen and just about the best science fiction writer out there by the Denver Rocky Mountain News, he's won all three of the world's top awards for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. A Hugo, for which he won for Hominids, the Nebula for the Terminal Experiment, John W. Campbell Memorial Award for Mind Scan, and the Robert A. Heinlein Award. Internationally, he's the top science fiction award holder in Japan 3 times, Spain 3 times, France and China, and a record-setting 17 Canadian science fiction and fantasy awards called the Auroras. His 25 best-selling novels include The Oppenheimer Alternative, The Downloaded, and Flash Forward, which was adapted into the ABC TV series of the same name. Rob was one of the scriptwriters for that series, and he also wrote the 2-part finale for the popular fan film series Star Trek Continues. He was a guest of honor at the 2023 World Science Fiction Convention, Worldcon, and is a member of the Order of Canada, the highest honor bestowed by the Canadian government. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Robert J. Sawyer.
Thank you, everybody. I am delighted to be here. I'm just outside Toronto, Canada, to locate you in space. We're all sharing the same time right now. I'm happy to be here. I see a lot of hands waving back at me. That's nice to see. Thank you. But the way we do it when we start a science fiction talk is with this particular gesture, which, of course, Leonard Nimoy came up with for the Star Trek episode Amok Time, second season, first episode of that classic series. That it means live long and prosper, which is something I certainly hope all of us are going to continue to do in these particularly fraught times that we're living in at the moment. I want to talk about the history of science fiction a little bit to get us started. But I'm going to take even one step even farther back and say there are only 2 genres of fiction. The genres are the standard categories: romance, mystery, western, thriller, so on and so forth, fantasy, science fiction, that have established birth dates where we can point to a work and say that was the start of the genre. One of them, the more recent of the 2, is the detective novel. It was created by Edgar Allan Poe, and it was created in 1841 with Murders in the Rue Morgue, a mode of storytelling that hitherto had not existed, and since, of course, has become one of the absolute most popular genres of fiction in the world. The other one is science fiction, as distinct from fantasy. And there was a lot of debate for many, many years in the academy about when science fiction got its start. And it was put to rest finally by a British science fiction writer, editor, and academic, friend of mine, Brian Aldiss, who has sadly passed away. But he made the definitive case that after some debate, finally convinced everybody that the first science fiction novel, is distinct from any other kind of writing, came out in 1818, and it was called Frankenstein. Now, we tend to think of Frankenstein as a Gothic novel or a horror novel, but let's zoom back a little bit and think about exactly what Frankenstein does that had never been done before. And when I say what Frankenstein does, I mean what the character of Frankenstein does. As all of you know, I'm sure, Frankenstein is not the creature so famously brought to the screen, portrayed by Boris Karloff, but is the creature's creator, in the movie, Dr. Frankenstein. In the novel, in Mary Shelley's novel, he's not identified as having a doctorate, but he is identified as somebody who started with an interest in alchemy, that was close to legitimate science in the early 1800s, but transitioned into an interest in more modern medical procedures and went to study at university, to study medicine. Now, he did something no fictional character had ever done before. He had a hypothesis rooted in the real present-day science of the early 1800s. In the early 1800s, the world was quite interested in the work of an Italian researcher, a real man named Galvani, whose name lives on in our word today, galvanized. What did Galvani famously do? He applied electricity to amputated, cut off frogs' legs and made them twitch. Astonishing, dead matter, cut off from the heart, the brain, every other part of the frog. And by applying electricity to it, he could nonetheless cause muscle contractions and movements in them. Well, this caught the public imagination and particularly caught the imagination of Mary Shelley, the author, obviously, of Frankenstein. And so she has her character, Frankenstein, say, huh, this is interesting. If you apply electricity to dead matter, you can get it to give an imitation of life. A frog's leg can be made to jerk. What if we applied more electricity to a larger congregation of dead matter, in fact, enough dead matter to constitute a human body? Could we, in fact, not just make the body jerk, but literally give it the quickening, bring it back to life, give it life from electricity? So a hypothesis, an idea that could be tested experimentally, which is what Frankenstein, the scientist researcher, does in the novel. He contrives an experiment and does indeed provide via captured lightning enough of an electrical jolt to animate. Now, it's hard to come by a dead body legitimately, a human dead body legitimately. And so he didn't have a complete single corpse. He had to get bits and pieces and sew them together to make a head-to-toe human form. But his experiment, his hypothesis of applying electricity, make a dead body come to life, conducted an experiment, and lo and behold, it works. So Frankenstein was the first novel, the first fictional exploration set around the scientific method as we know it today. And that was the crux of Aldous' argument. Therefore, this is unlike any other thing like the Golem of Prague or any other created life form that was created essentially through magic or incantation. It was unlike any previous whimsies about going to the moon or other planets that had no scientific basis in how it might be done. It was completely new at the time. It was sui generis, something that was completely unique. Subsequently, of course, became a very significant literary form. Now, when we talk about that, that's the easy part of why Frankenstein is interesting. We would laud it if that was all it had done. If that was just it, we would say, okay, it created the genre of science fiction. But I'm much more interested in science fiction, as Matt alluded in reading my little précis for this talk, as a field for social commentary. And it's absolutely true. If you go to university now, and I'll say, by the way, when I was starting in university, I entered a class of 79. There were very few universities that had science fiction literature courses. My university in Toronto did not have one. I used to sneak over to the University of Toronto, where they did have one. But even then, the fellow who was teaching it, who I think was the first to teach a science fiction course in Canada, his name was Peter Fitting, and he had been denied permission to teach it in the English department. We don't want anything to do with that crap. So he made a deal with the French department. He said, I want to teach a science fiction course. They won't let me teach it in the English department. I want to teach it to English language students, but I will include the great French writer, Jules Verne, if you let me teach it in the French department. So the Academy certainly always, now that there are science fiction courses everywhere, almost every university has an undergraduate science fiction course. And many will have master's programs, or at the University of Liverpool, recently retired, my buddy Andy Sawyer, no relation, ran a PhD program in science fiction there. They would obviously teach it usually as the very first book in a science fiction course, as you do a historical survey of the genre. But it's also widely taught to this day in another branch of the academy. And the course that it's taught in surprises people. People say, well, I asked, in a more interactive venue than this. What might be, where do you think it's taught? Well, philosophy, yeah, maybe. Medical history, yeah, possibly. Gothic literature, of course. But the place where it's most commonly taught these days is women's studies or feminist studies. Now, why is that? Why would this novel, obviously written by a woman, of course, Mary Shelley, it's significant that it was written by a woman. It's written by a woman who was married to a slightly older but much more famous man in the day. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet, was Mary Shelley's husband. Today, I think if you ask anybody who is Shelley, they're just as likely to say Mary, if not more likely than they are to say Percy when asked to name a famous Shelley. But she was a woman in a society in the early 1800s who had obviously taken the last name of her husband, but couldn't take his property if he died. She couldn't have the power of inheritance. She couldn't go and follow him into the voting booth to vote. She didn't have the franchise. The franchise is literally the right of expressing yourself at the ballot box. She couldn't inherit property. She couldn't hold most jobs. There's very little that she could actually do except write. And it turned out she could write spectacularly well. And so she started thinking about not just the experiment. If we took Galvani's principle and applied it to a dead body, could we bring it to life? She wanted to say something very profound about men versus women in the early 1800s. And some would argue that her perception resonates still today. She said, that men and women both are required for the act of procreation. It's a biological reality. The two gametes, male and female, come together to fertilize sperm to fertilize the egg. But the man really enjoys that moment of providing his little contribution there of 23 chromosomes. The woman, on the other hand, her job is not done at that moment. She has to carry the body, the child in her body, to maturity for 9 months, and then very often suckle, nurture the child for a period of quite significant time. The parental investment on the part of the woman is much greater than on the part of the man. And the only power that women had that men did not possess in 1818 when Frankenstein was published, of course, it was written prior to that. It was published January 1st, actually, 1818. The only power they had was the creation, the fulfillment of the creation of life, of bringing to term a child and nurturing a child from their own body. And she said, if that one power that God or nature has bestowed solely upon women were to be taken from us by men, it would be disastrous because they're only interested in that moment of release where they happen to provide the sperm. They're interested in the orgasm. And they would, if you turned it over to men, the creation of life, it would be disastrous because once they've proven that life can be created, they lose interest, which is exactly what Victor does in Frankenstein. He abandons his creation instead of saying, now this is my from my body, my life, I have to nurture it and bring it fully into engagement with the world. He abandons his creation. So Mary was making a very profound comment. And given that 200 years later, on the anniversary of Frankenstein, Roe v. Wade was still the law of the land in the United States, the bicentennial in 2018. But I had predicted way back in a 1995 novel that Roe was going to fall in the United States. That novel is The Terminal Experiment, the one that I won the Nebula Award for. And I reiterated it later on in my novel Flash Forward. And indeed it did. Indeed, when it became possible for men to legislatively take control over women's reproductive freedom, they lost that reproductive freedom. That Mary Shelley's message that if we let men take control of reproduction, it will be disastrous, A, for the progeny, and B, of course, for women. So that novel was very much a novel of social comment and is still widely celebrated and read, as I said, in feminist literature or in women's studies. Now, Mary is obviously the grandmother of the science fiction genre, but the genre has two grandfathers. I've already alluded to one of them, Jules Verne, the Frenchman. The other one, of course, is a Brit, H.G. Wells. Now, they were very different writers. And despite what Peter Fitting did to try to get to be able to teach his science fiction course by saying, oh, we will celebrate Verne, not that many people read Verne anymore. Now, I said at the outset there are only two genres that have definable birth dates. One is the detective novel, Murders in the Rue Morgue. The other is science fiction. Arguably, there's a third. That third is the one that Jules Verne created. And it's not science fiction. He created something close to our modern techno thriller. If you read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which, by the way, is 20,000 leagues horizontally, you can't go 20,000 vertically. It's too far to go down. If you read it, it reminds me of a famous American novel, which you guys were probably all forced to read. We Canadians weren't. We have our own canon here north of the border, but I subsequently read it anyways. That novel was Moby Dick. If you read Moby Dick, you'll recognize that every other chapter in Moby Dick does not advance the plot of Ahab and the whale and Queequeg and Ishmael. It's a chapter of technical description about flensing blubber off of a whale carcass, or the hydrodynamics of harpoons, or something like that. It is full of the kind of reveille in technical detail that Tom Clancy would later go on to make famous. So Clancy, of course, wrote The Hunt for Red October, which is a direct descendant from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and that Verne created the submarine novel, obviously. And Verne reveled in the technical details. And that's about all he has to offer. Somebody was asking me, what should I read if I'm going to read Jules Verne? And I said, the one to read is his mainstream novel. Forget his science fiction, which is devoid of character, particularly, and blah blah blah. Read his mainstream novel, which is Around the World in 80 Days. It's fun. It's a frolic. It's got a great twist ending. It's an enjoyable book for sure, but it's not science fiction. H.G. Wells looked at the tools of science fiction, and Verne had preceded him. Verne had already come along and said, this is what science fiction is going to be. It's going to be technical tales. And Wells said, I don't think that's what Mother Mary had in mind. And so H.G. Wells came along and started writing his own brand of science fiction. Now, of course, we did not have this term. The term science fiction did not exist in 1800s, did not exist in the 1900s. This year is the 100th anniversary, the centenary of the word science fiction. In April of this year, it'll be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the world's first science fiction magazine. That magazine was called Amazing Stories. It still exists in an extant form. The editor of the current iteration actually lives here in Toronto. His name is Lloyd Penny, an old friend of mine. When that magazine debuted, its publisher, who had been doing magazines about electronics and other technical matters, decided to do a science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories. His name was Hugo Gernsback. The top science fiction award, the Hugo, is not named for Victor Hugo. It's named for the founder of Amazing Stories. And when he originally started the magazine, he called what the kind of story he was going to publish scientifiction, all run together, one word, scientifiction. It didn't stick. And so after a few issues, still in 2026, he rechristened it as the two words we know today, science fiction. When Wells was starting out, he didn't have that name. So he called what he was doing scientific romances. And by romance, he didn't mean love story. He meant romance as in, a roman, the French word for novel. He meant stories about science, which was a fine name for what he was doing, but it also only hinted at what he was doing, because he goes right back to Mary Shelley. And he said, okay, we can use the scientific method and the ideas out of science and talk about scientific experiments. But I want to do something more than that. So his first significant science fiction work was The Time Machine. And that's a title so good that to this, and it came out in 1895. Um, 131 years ago. So it's a name so good that to this day we call any device, of course, no one's built one yet, but any device that in any fiction or scientific debate for traveling backward or forward in time is referred to as a time machine. Excuse me. So, but that's not what the novel is about. And I should say, it's not even a novel. If you haven't read it, take the time because it's only 38,000 words, which is about a third the length of your typical bookstore novel these days. Mm, excuse me, I have a little bit of the weather and the sore throat and so forth. I'll try to remember to mute with my little space bar when I do that cough. Um, he didn't just want to write about the scientific matters of time travel, although he certainly was prepared to. If you read that time machine, the first line is the time traveler, or so it shall be convenient to refer to him, was espousing on a recondite matter. And it begins with him talking about what do we know about the scientific nature of time. And the novel has a Victorian gentleman traveling forward in time to the year 802 701 AD and has some adventures and then comes back. If that was all the time machine was about, it would have been a forgotten work, I think, because Wells wasn't interested in particularly just in the nature of time and going and having adventures in his fiction. He was a social reformer and a very liberal thinker. And he looked around at the world of 1895 and wanted to complain about something. The thing he wanted to complain about is what the time machine is really about, which is not time travel, and not the year 802 701 AD. It's about the British class system. And he knew if he complained about it, the only people who could listen to his complaints as a writer, I mean, he could stand on Speaker's Corner in London, obviously, and shout it to the wind. But as a writer, which is what he was professionally, the only people who could buy books were the leisure class. The working class didn't have money, even though they worked, ironically, it was the leisure class who had disposable income. And by and large, the only people who could read were the leisure class. The working class was quite often illiterate. So the only people he could talk to were his own people. He himself was leisure class and literate, obviously, as a writer. The message he wanted was not a banal one. Banal ones are easy, which is, the class system. I feel bad for the people who are at the bottom of the financial pyramid. Charles Dickens had already come along and said that, right? In Oliver Twist and in famously in A Christmas Carol, he had said, the Bob Cratchits of the world, they get a raw deal. What Wells wanted to say was, it's not just those Bob Cratchits. It's the Ebenezer Scrooges, the rich, who get a raw deal out of the class system. Because, and this was the message he wanted to promulgate, because if you don't think for yourself, and if you don't perform manual labor for yourself, you're going to end up feeble of mind and feeble of limb. You're going to end up being feckless, ineffective at everything. And so he extrapolated forward. One of the key words in talking about science fiction is this word, extrapolation, to take the arrow of history to where we are now and just move it forward. You don't do a vector off to one side or another. You look at where we are and you extrapolate. And he said, well, if the leisure class continues to basically not do any thinking and not do any work, they're going to, over time, become completely ineffective. And what does his time traveler find but that humanity has bifurcated, that the two classes where you could only tell them apart by perhaps their natty attire versus their grungy clothes as you walk down the streets of London had literally become two different species in the future. And it was the working class who was on top, at least figuratively, literally on top, on the surface. The feckless Eloi are frolicking in the sun and seem to have not a care in the world because they don't have a care in the world. They're provided with food, and what they do is they go about their days, and as happens in the novel, right at the beginning, one of them falls into the River Thames. The time travelers moved in space, but not in, sorry, in time, but not in space, and is drowning. And nobody knows what to do. They just sit and watch. He's drowning. They don't know how to swim. They don't know how to do CPR or artificial resuscitation. They don't know any of that stuff. They just are incapable because all they really turn out to be are food stocks, livestock, because the people who are on top are literally they're living underground, but the Morlocks actually can still make and operate machinery. They can still think and do things, and they have turned the leisure class into nothing but cattle that they feed upon. A very profound message to want to say to people. And Wells realized if he'd written that in one of his popular essays or historical, he was became best known as a historian. Um, the leisure class would not pay attention. And he realized that Mary Shelley had handed him a gift. The gift was you could get people to read very interesting sociological commentary if they don't know that's what they're getting going in. Nobody goes in to Frankenstein thinking this will be an interesting exploration of male control over female reproductive freedom. Nobody goes into reading thinking that's what they're going to get. But if you're an attentive, intelligent, thoughtful reader, and this is a Mensa gathering here, so I'm sure you all are, that's what you come out with. Stealth social commentary. And this is what Wells did. He said, nobody's going to listen to me. Yeah, I said about a time machine, and they go to the future. And oh, really? Nobody had ever written a story like that with a scientific basis behind it. Um, and people read it in droves, and he snuck up on you. With what he wanted to say, he did it again a few years later with the War of the Worlds, which was his another one of his science fiction scientific romances. War of the Worlds is even less about science, and it doesn't propose an experiment conducted by us, by a human being. If anybody's conducting an experiment in War of the Worlds, whereas the time travel and time machine was definitely an inventor, had a theory, I could do this, and it'll let me travel to the future, an experiment, hypothesis, experiment, result. In Time Machine, in War of the Worlds, I should say, there is people just going about their everyday lives when objects start falling out of the sky. One in Herschel Common, not far from London, where out of this metallic cylinder, which people had originally mistaken for a meteorite, it's artificial, and out of it come Martian invaders. And if there was an experiment, it was on Mars, where the Martians said, oh, I wonder if we shoot a big gun at Earth with a projectile in it, if one of us or many of us could survive and get to Mars and get from Mars to Earth and possibly seize that land for ourselves, which is in fact what they try to do. Now, what's interesting about the novel is what Wells again was trying to say by stealth. Because Wells, a social reformer, looked around at one of the great hubrises of human history, was calling Britain Great Britain, giving itself the name Great Britain. I mean, that's pretty, I'd like to be known as the great Robert J. Sawyer, but so far nobody has decided that I deserve that in front of my name all the time. But Great Britain was the name of his country at that time. And the other great hubris came from Carl Linnaeus, who decided that our name as a species should be Homo sapiens, which means the wise people. I don't know about that. It's this to bestow upon us wisdom is something that historically seemed to have been very lacking in Homo sapiens and is certainly a vanishingly rare commodity amongst the 8 billion of us alive today. But Wells looked around at Great Britain and said, we are awful. We are horrible. We are going all over this planet and crushing underfoot indigenous cultures and claiming their lands for our own simply because we look at them with envious eyes because they have things that we don't have. And indeed, that's how he describes his Martians, turning slowly and surely. They look at this Earth with envious eyes and slowly but surely turn their plans against us. Wells has his Martians build these famous machines. You've all seen depictions of them, the tripods, the three-legged walking machines that let his Martians, who of course couldn't endure Earth's gravity. Wells knew everything there was to know about Mars that we knew at the beginning of the 20th century. 1902 is when War of the Worlds was published. Um, Everything we knew. He knew that it had 35% of Earth's gravity. He knew that his Martians couldn't walk around on their own on the planet. They would need some mechanical conveyance, blah, blah, blah. The conveyance he decided on was a tripod. Interesting, a tripod. Why? There are two ways you can constitute a tripod. One is with two legs in front and one hanging out the back like a tail. And the other, the one Wells had in mind, is two legs in the back and a third macho phallic leg hanging off the front because his tripods represented Great Britain. They represented it marching and crushing underfoot, which is the chapter title, one of his chapters, indigenous cultures with this macho posturing that it was for their own good that we were going in and that it was reprehensible. And in the end, it was going to, the attempt to do that was going to end in failure for the entire species of Great Britain or the entire species of the Martians. He wanted to make a social comment. So science fiction is not only about science. I mean, that's fine. You know, a little bit of scientific speculation. It's always interesting. But good science fiction has had something to say that it wanted to get people to consider that they wouldn't have normally sat still for an exploration of because they have their natural blinders and their prejudices. So the standard toolkit of science fiction is dislocations in space, another planet, another galaxy sometimes, dislocations in time, the far future, the ancient past, or conceivably an alternate timeline, and dislocations of who is telling the story. Not all science fiction stories deal with human beings. They either have aliens or sentient robots or AIs or so forth. Another perspective is brought into play, and it lets you get at these social commentary stories. And I think that in the end, we've lost some of that in some modern science fiction. There's a lot of science fiction, a whole class of science fiction called military science fiction, another class called space opera, neither of which are particularly ambitious. In terms of you read them, they're action adventure, the pages fly by, and they can be written extremely well. In terms of the prose, they're not always, I don't think that's necessarily a requirement for a lot of the readers of those categories that the prose be scintillating, just as long as the pulse gets pounding while you read them. But good science fiction, I think, should be about something and often is. Now, 1968, it's going to be a long time ago, obviously, but it's significant because within a few weeks of each other, two of the most significant science fiction films ever made premiered. One was 2001, A Space Odyssey, and the other one was the original Planet of the Apes. They're within weeks of each other of being the same age, those films. And many people ask me, 2001, does it hold up and so forth? And I actually, on Christmas Day, the Toronto International Film Festival is one of the big film festivals of the world up there with Cannes and Sundance and so forth. But they have screenings all year round. And on Christmas Day, for a special screening this year, by which I mean 2025, just last month, they were doing 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I took my wife, obviously, but also two of my nieces and the husband of one of my nieces to see it. Now, the husband of one of my nieces, Richard, it's the son I never had. Of course, he'd seen 2001. But the other two nieces had never, who were in their 30s, had never seen it. One had never seen it at all, and one other had only seen clips. And I took it. And Does it hold up? Well, in some sense, yes, it's visually stunning, absolutely. But in another sense, no. You look there, this came out in 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. The civil rights movement was sweeping the United States. Now, granted, the film was made in Great Britain, but there's no question but that Stanley Kubrick was familiar with Star Trek because he actually cast the character Frank Poole, played by Gary Lockwood, because he'd been impressed by Lockwood's work on Star Trek. Lockwood had appeared in the second pilot for Star Trek, which aired early on in the first run of Star Trek. And one thing Star Trek had was a multiracial crew. And one thing Star Trek had was women in positions of authority. None of that in 2001. Everybody, the five astronauts aboard the spaceship Discovery, are all white men, not a woman aboard. Every woman you see, except for a Russian, special dispensation for Russians, they'd already put Valentina Tereshkova, a woman in space. Except for the Russians, every woman you see in 2001 is subservient, is a telephone operator or a receptionist or something of that ilk. Kubrick was completely oblivious to what was going on in 1968 and yet trying to extrapolate forward. Well, what did I say? You extrapolate forward not by just saying, I'll start here today and pick a random direction to extrapolate. Science fiction. It was my friend Kim Stanley Robinson, famous for the trilogy of Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, who, when I interviewed him a million years ago, i.e. 1989, excuse me, for CBC Radio, he said this to me. Science fiction is basically a branch of historical fiction because you have to, if you're going to extrapolate into the future, you have to start in the past. You have to know the direction that history is moving if you're going to make a reasonable extrapolation. What Kubrick did is say, starting here in 68, anybody's guess. And he picked a vector that utterly ignored the previous few years of history, which was the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. So he extrapolated that in 2001, there would be no particular role for women or people of color in American life. Complete and utter failure as a work of prediction. And he put a date on it. And when you put a date on it, you're locking yourself in. You have to be judged by the reality of 2001 if you're going to put a date on it. What about Planet of the Apes? Well, Planet of the Apes never set out to be a particularly scientifically accurate film. That said, they do have a debate about, they're actually going to travel at relativistic speeds and whether they really will end up traveling far into the future. They have a goal in mind. They think they're going probably to Bellatrix, a star in the constellation of Orion. There's a lot of overlap between 2001 and Planet of the Apes. Both have anthropoids in them. In 2001, it's our Australopithecine ancestors. Obviously, it's the great apes in Planet of the Apes. They both use hibernation for their spaceship voyages. Taylor and his crew hibernate. Frank Poole and Dave Bowman's colleagues are in hibernation. They both end up with great dislocations in time during the course of the movies and so forth. Planet of the Apes. So, and there's a meme that goes around that says, so Taylor's an astronaut, right? He should know about constellations, right? So how could he be fooled that he's, back on Earth? Well, the movie actually covers that. They do pay attention to science. There's a constant auroral glow at night that obscures the sky, and they go and say there is no moon, a debatable comment about whether the moon simply wasn't visible or had been destroyed. In the Greater Apes publishing canon, it now actually is that the moon had been destroyed. And so you look up at the night sky, you can't see the constellations. You don't know that you're still on Earth. You can't see the moon, can't see the constellations. So, but what was Planet of the Apes about? Well, that film is a classic example of one of Robert J. Sawyer's dictums, which is no science fiction work is about the year it's putatively set in. It's about the year in which it was composed. And Planet of the Apes came out in early 68, February, was obviously made in 67. And in 67, every newspaper that you grabbed across the world, particularly in the United States, there were two main front page stories that people were obsessing over. One was the fear of nuclear war, and the other was race relations. And Planet of the Apes is entirely about those two issues, the issues of the day, the fear of nuclear war. I don't want to spoil the film for you. If you haven't seen it, you got to go see it. You got to watch it. But it is absolutely an anti-nuclear war film. And it is right on the nose about being about race relations. Now, if you say, oh, you're reading too much into it, the first ape who speaks in Planet of the Apes is just a guerrilla photographer, says one word, he says, smile, ha, 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 and they take a group photo. The next ape who speaks is a male chimpanzee talking to a female chimpanzee. Male is Dr. Galen, a surgeon, and he is lamenting that there's a glass ceiling that he can't advance beyond. And he says, you made it to the female chimpanzee. Why can't I? And she says, well, my work is deemed of value to the government, but your work is not. And you know how they look down their nose at chimpanzees, they being the orangutans who are in power. And he says the quota system has been abolished. And she just basically looks at him like he's naive, right? Because even if there's equality on paper, there isn't equality in actuality. To drive this home, when Planet of the Apes came out, Sammy Davis Jr., famous African-American entertainer, said to Arthur P. Jacobs, the producer, you have made the most trenchant commentary on race relations that anybody's ever put on film. And this was in the era of all kinds of people trying to capture the zeitgeist of race relations in the United States. Jacobs was so impressed by Davis's astute recognition of what they were doing that he actually gifted him the giant lawgiver statue that you see in Planet of the Apes. And Sammy Davis Jr. and his wife Altavis had it at their estate for many, many years. It was a film that got people into the theater on the notion that you're going to see apes with guns hunting humans, and get that exact same Mary Shelley, H.G. Wells disguise metaphor mask, literally masks or latex appliances in Planet of the Apes, of getting you into the seat so I can talk to you about race relations and I can talk to you about the evils of nuclear war. And the whole Planet of the Apes, the original 5-film series, gets very, very deep into that, particularly the fourth film, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, which is a parable about the Watts race riots in 1965 in Los Angeles. So science fiction at its best is always talking about social issues with disguise, metaphor, and mask. Now, in the introductory comments, Matt said that Star Wars is not science fiction. And people say, well, spaceships, they got robots. How can it be anything but science fiction? The answer is, even before you see your first spaceship, even before you see your first robot or droid in Star Wars, what do you see? You see these words, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, with 4 ellipsis points afterwards, where Ian Randall Strock, who is in the audience here, the author of Punctilious Punctuation, might agree with me that there should have only been 3, but there are 4. In any event, that, of course, is a paraphrase of the classic opening of fairy tales. And that's what Star Wars is. Star Wars is not science fiction, it is fantasy. It is fantasy cosplaying, masquerading as science fiction. Sure, any given frame out of the film, or most frames out of the film, they look like science fiction. There's technology, there's robots, there's aliens, including, of course, all the human characters are aliens. They're not Homo sapiens from the planet Earth, obviously, because they're in a galaxy far, far away. But it is, in its structure and in its story, it is not science fiction. How do we know? It's a story about a wizard, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and a religious sect the Jedi Knights, knights being mere fantasy trope, who have a mystical power. And it's even referred to as a mystical power. How do we know that it's all fantasy and not science fiction? Because we all had the same visceral reaction when George Lucas decided he was going to try to introduce a rational scientific explanation and brought in the midichlorians, which are a play on mitochondria as organelles in the cells of Jedi Knights that imbued them with telekinetic powers and telepathic powers. It's not, no, George, that's not right. Everybody hated it because we knew at a gut level that it wasn't science fiction, that it was fantasy. What's the distinction? Science fiction is things that plausibly might happen. Fantasy is things that never could happen. Fantasy is based on magic. Science fiction is based on the laws of physics and the other laws of nature that we know and continue to wrestle with working out all the details of in the quantum reality of the multiverse. So they're not allied genres at all. They don't belong together. And the reason they're together historically is a fluke of US copyright law. The reason they're together historically is because there used to be a provision in the American copyright law that said if a work did not have a domestic English language version in the United States from a US publisher within X number of months or years of publication, it could be treated as public domain in the United States. And so Donald A. Wollheim, a science fiction editor, the science fiction editor for Ace at the time, I think, pirated Lord of the Rings. And since he only had a science fiction line, he published it in his science fiction line. And that's why science fiction and fantasy were fused together, because Lord of the Rings, there was no section in the bookstore to put Lord of the Rings in. And so it ended up in the science fiction section, and the commingling dates to that, the significant commingling. But they're orthogonal. One is about things that could happen, and one is about things that couldn't happen. Now, Star Wars, if it were science fiction, if we had bought into its premise, if we felt that it was something that really could happen, we would be looking for the social commentary subtext in it. Well, let's think about the name of our particular thing here tonight, if I've got it right, is the M. Wisely Cantina. That's obviously a play on the Mos Eisley Cantina from Star Wars, as I know it, just when I saw it in 77, that was all it was called. As we now know, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. What happens when Luke, well, first, we'll get to that, even before we get to Cantina, Luke is portrayed as what? He lives on a plantation right out of the Old South. Yes, they're harvesting moisture instead of harvesting cotton. Who works on the plantation? Slaves, robots, bought from slave dealers. The Jawas are slave dealers. How do we know that R2 and C3PO are slaves? Because as soon as Luke acquires them, he bolts onto them, welds onto them, restraining bolts. 3PO's is up here, and R2's is bolted onto him elsewhere. These are manacles to keep the slaves from running away. How do we know they're slaves? Because throughout the entire film, 3PO calls Luke master. How do we know that they're second-class citizens? How do we know that they're stand-ins for African Americans? Because when we do get, not to the M. Wisely Cantina, but the Mos Eisley Cantina, and Luke and Obi-Wan enter the bar, the bartender looks and sees 3PO and R2-D2 coming in behind them and says, "We don't serve their kind in here." 1977, you go back 12 years, 65, you could find endless numbers of bars in the United States that could legally say that to African Americans. If Star Wars was a work of science fiction, socially relevant, trying to make a socially relevant point, then at that point, the hitherto benighted, unaware hero of the piece, Luke, would have realized the injustice of this because he knows R2 and 3PO are feeling, sentient, thinking beings. And he would have said to the bartender, if their money's no good in here, my money's no good in here, and marched out. Instead, he turns to them and says, we don't want any trouble. You better wait outside. And the audience blithely accepts that because they're not in a science fictional mode of thinking. They're in a fantasy mode of thinking. And really, there's only one other time where Lucas even tries social comment in Star Wars, and that's when Emperor Palpatine post 9/11, echoing George W. Bush voting himself or taking to himself extraordinary powers, and Palpatine takes extraordinary powers, and Amidala says, "So this is how freedom dies," to thunderous applause. Well, nobody paid much attention then, and of course, one can argue that that message should have been heeded much more significantly and resonates quite significantly in the current political situation. But Star Wars is fantasy. It wasn't trying to reasonably extrapolate. In fact, Lucas said, famously, he used parsec, which is a unit of distance, the parallax of 1 second of arc, 3.26 light years, as a unit of time. He didn't care. He has his ships. The Millennium Falcon makes the jump to light speed. Albert Einstein never said you couldn't go faster than the speed of light. He said you could not accelerate to the speed of light and go any faster because at the speed of light, your mass will become infinite, your length will become zero, and so on and so forth. You won't be able. It's a point you can't go past. It's impossible to move at the speed of light. Lucas didn't care, right? And so that's the speed. They go to light speed. There's no science at all in Star Wars. It is not science fiction. And the fact that the social comment in it is ignored, just not even mentioned, that Luke is a plantation owner's son who buys slaves, manacles them, makes them call him master, and treats them as second-class citizens, just flies by. If it was a work of science fiction, like, say, I don't know, Planet of the Apes, the social commentary is right in there. We're talking about a quota system. We're talking about 3 different species, actually genera, of apes, gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees, each of whom look down upon the other, but one of whom has seized power. Funnily, the orange one has seized power in Planet of the Apes and is systematically suppressing the darker-skinned gorillas and the chimpanzees. So Planet of the Apes is, in fact, science fiction. Even if the science is not foregrounded, Star Wars is fantasy, even though it looks much more in every frame like science fiction. I've gone on for most of an hour here, so I'll just sort of wrap up by saying that a lot of people, even those who make science fiction, or the studios that control the making of science fiction, don't understand what they've got. And there's a tendency to start out with something that is really significant and profound and make it, as they did with Planet of the Apes. There was a real, kids really love this. It was never intended as a kid's film. 1968's Planet of the Apes. It actually has Charlton Heston's only nude scenes in it. You clearly see him naked from the back. And if you have spare time and the inclination, if you go slow-mo on the Blu-ray, you can see his junk quite clearly from the front as well as he's diving into the water. It has very salty language for 1968. And in fact, Charlton Heston himself had to go to the censor, the film censor, who was going to give Planet of the Apes a restricted rating. Wouldn't let them use the line that they wanted to use at the end. The line at the end that Charlton Heston utters very famously, he says, "Damn you." Well, you can say that. And then he goes on to say, "God damn you all to hell." And the censor said, you can't say that. You can't say "God damn." And this is Moses, remember, going into the censor's office. Charlton Heston had played Moses in the Ten Commandments. And he goes in and says, well, A, I'm kind of an authority on biblical language. But B, the character's not saying "God damn." He is saying God, comma, calling on the deity to damn these people for their folly of blowing up the planet through nuclear war. And the censor literally said, whom I'd argue with Moses, and let the line stand. But it was a movie that, from its very first spoken line of dialogue, which was about race relations, to its very last spoken line of dialogue, which was about nuclear war, was a film aimed at adults. But the franchise got dumbed down and dumbed down. By the time it came to television, it was so anodyne. But now there was a Planet of the Apes TV series, 14 episodes, made in 1974, that it was just kiddie fare, and it had lost its edge. Science fiction is supposed to be a literature with an edge. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very, very informative, and it went much more in depth than I had thought. I do have several questions that were sent to me. I'm going to start with one of mine. Are you familiar with Babylon 5? Did you watch that series?
So yes, I mentioned that my friend Ian Randall Strock is here, and Ian and I were the board of directors. I was president, Ian was treasurer, during a fraught time in SFWA's history, the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America. But one thing that I did was I resurrected a moribund award. We had a Ray Bradbury Award that hadn't been given for ages. And I said, what J. Michael Straczynski had done was so significant, in terms of just from this, we're obviously a writers' organization. So in terms of writing almost every episode of this series himself, and doing something that was reasonably profound, that I resurrected the Ray Bradbury Award and gave it to JMS for Babylon 5. So yes, absolutely. He was trying to do significant stuff there. That said, I was disappointed. I recognized, your role as president is, part to be cheerleader for your field. And I recognized that it was significant. And yet, Babylon 5 came out in the 90s, and I was regretful that it was only an incremental increase over what Star Trek had done in the original series in terms of social comment in the 60s. I would have liked for the field, in terms of its representation in film and television, to have advanced much more significantly in that time frame, because certainly the 1960s science fiction, that's the period of what was called the new wave in science fiction. Science fiction remade itself both in terms of literary quality and in terms of focusing very much in the Shelley Wells paradigm of social comment. So yes, Babylon 5, I personally was responsible for giving JMS an award for that achievement. I just wish that achievement had come in 72, 3 years after Star Trek, the original series, not 3 decades after it.
Yeah, I just started watching the series again, and originally I hadn't seen as much as the social content, but it's what's happening today, so I was very impressed with that.
The political side, yeah, it's very astute on that. And it's also, of course, it's a fun show to watch. Ironically, I think the most interesting characters are the aliens. Science fiction has a tendency to fall down in portraying humans. So Star Trek, right? Spock, Data, these are the characters that people rally around. It's Jakar and Londo in Babylon 5. There's this problem when it's easy to create an alien because they're oddball and they don't have to be very complex to be intriguing. It's hard to create an intriguing human being. One of my, not to brag or anything, but I'm proud of a novel I wrote called Starplex. I tried to write a novel where the humans were as nuanced and interesting and flawed as you would find in any mainstream fiction, and that the aliens were equally that. And it was the only novel of its year to be nominated for both the Hugo and the Nebula, won Canada's Aurora. So I think I came to some degree to achieving that. But yeah, science fiction with intriguing aliens, we always like to rally around them. And that was one of the great things that B5 did. Somebody else?
Somebody else asked, are you able to comment on Fritz Lang's silent movie, Metropolis?
Am I able to comment on it? We're on track while we talk about Fritz Lang's Metropolis, but there's Maria from Metropolis, who sits right opposite my workstation so that she can inspire me. Those who've never seen Metropolis will still recognize Maria because obviously C-3PO is patterned after Maria. Fascinating film, all about mechanization, workers' rights. Absolutely, a wonderful film. I had the great joy of seeing it at a wonderful theater here in Toronto at the Ontario Science Center with live organ accompaniment. And just, yeah, spectacular piece of science fiction as social commentary with just one of the coolest robots ever made. There she is.
I'm sorry. How do you describe this? Well, I think you answered this one of distinguishing science fiction from fantasy, because that's really what you were talking about. But she is specifically asking about Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, which obviously was very political.
Oh, absolutely. So when people ask me what genre Planet of the Apes belongs to, for the purposes of this talk, obviously I say science fiction, and I stand by that. But also Swiftonian satire. It is very much descended from Jonathan Swift. And absolutely, you know, since the dawn of time, we have been aware that there are stars. We've been aware that there's at least one other world or one other thing up there that looks like it has geography. The moon, you can't miss it. But we didn't know what they were. We didn't know, you know, that there was no air between here and them, for instance. So that you couldn't just fly on wings like Icarus and get to, you know, get into outer space. There was simply to say that just because something acknowledges that space exists makes it science fiction is to deny the reality of every myth maker and just every casual observer. Oh, you know, as long as you don't have that constant glow at night that they had in Planet of the Apes, so you can't see the night sky, of course you're going to look up and wonder about those things and what they are and can we get to them and do that, particularly obviously the moon, but also stars and the planets, the wanderers, planetes in Greek, the wandering stars that moved against the backdrop of the fixed stars. They were clearly intriguing. One of them was red, which is the color of blood. You know, that being Mars. So sure, obviously we wondered about these things, but I drew the line for science fiction, as Brian Aldiss did, when somebody wrote a story that was immersed in what we called science. Science as a discipline didn't really exist until in the modern paradigm, until we had the scientific method of hypothesis, experimentation, refutation, replication, and moving on to wherever the next hypothesis, the next experiment might take us to. That simply doesn't exist in Lucian of Samosata, doesn't exist in Gulliver's Travels, it doesn't exist in the Golem of Prague, or any of these things that are sometimes looked at as proto.
Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
I think this is one of the better meetings that we've had. You went into so much detail, so much information.
Thank you all so much. Live long and prosper.